Welcome, guys, back to another episode of the Health Mastery Show. I'm your host, Adam McDonald, and today's episode is a little bit different. I have on with me Mike Matthews from Legion Athletics. He is also a business owner. He puts out a lot of great content himself with regards to health and fitness from his own podcast, the Muscle for Life podcast. And today's conversation, we talk all about his recommendations on books and how he strategizes and picks and learns from books that he reads. It was based off a podcast that I listened to a podcast of his a couple of months ago, and this podcast in fact was recorded way back in last year, sometime around September, perhaps even earlier than that. And initially when I started this podcast, the idea was to take the principles of natural bodybuilding and apply them to your life. And as bodybuilders, or if you're somebody who likes bodybuilding recreationally, that regiment and improvement is something that is important to you. And I really like the structure that Mike takes when he tries to learn new content, whether that be from books or podcasts or whatever it may be. And I personally really, really enjoyed having this conversation. And I'm not going to lie, I use this podcast platform as a way to talk to people like Mike, who owns a multi-million dollar business, to learn myself. And I'm not going to lie about that, because that's one of the great things about having your own podcast. And you're able to talk to people like Mike, and then you're able to have conversations that you like. So hopefully you guys enjoy this podcast as well. I've definitely taken some of the recommendations that he mentioned. I ended up getting a Kindle afterwards, and I do the whisper sync method or function that Mike talks about in this podcast. And I've read many of the books, and I find personally that when I do read a lot, it's when I'm feeling my best mentally. And I think it's important to identify your diversity, or diversify your identity, should I say. So it's something I've heard Tim Ferriss, who's a very well-known podcaster, talk about before, is that you identify or you diversify your identity, much like you would diversify an investment portfolio, so that if something fails, then at least you have others that are either going to hold you up or else improve. And I think that's the same for life as well. I really like that quote from Tim Ferriss. And I really like reading and learning as well. So I know that I can't get to the gym because of this whole pandemic thing. I do have some set up at home. Not ideal, but I'm sure that's the same for everybody else. But I can kind of take it or leave it, or at least I'm making the most out of this situation. So I'm doubling down on my reading. I'm learning a lot more, and I'm seeing this as a blessing in disguise, as difficult as it may seem. So again, hope you enjoy this podcast, and if you do want to ask any questions to myself or to Mike, you can always find our contact details or social media handles down in the show notes. So without further ado, let's get into this podcast with Mike. So Mike, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. I know it's been kind of a little bit difficult for us to match schedules, but I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So you're a best-selling author. You own a coaching business. And is that your main kind of thing that you're doing right now?
No, so the coaching is really just a part of it's a small part of the bigger business, which is supplements, sports nutrition. So the company is Legion Athletics, and it is a supplement company. It's a sports nutrition company. And the coaching was really a separate thing that was attached to a popular website that I had called Muscle for Life. And I let's see, it was probably 2 months ago, merged Muscle for Life into Legion, which I should have done a long time ago. I was basically juggling two blogs. I had a blog at Muscle for Life, which last year, summer, before the Google Medic update, it peaked at about 1.8 million visits a month. And then I had another blog over at Legion that peaked at about 2 million visits a month. And so it became like a bit of a strategic question as to like what exactly is Muscle for Life doing, because it gets a lot of traffic and people know about it, but it really is just a glorified blog. And yeah, we have this coaching service, and it does quite well for a coaching service, but it's still it'll do probably close to $1 million in revenue this year, which is cool, but Legion will do close to $20 million in revenue. So even from that perspective is like, why does Muscle for Life exist? And then after the Google Medic update, after the first one rolled out, it became clear that it was going to be it was going to require a lot more to continue remaining competitive in health and fitness SEO. So that's when I was like, we just need to roll these things together so we can focus on one property. Legion can benefit from I had hundreds of articles that I had written at Muscle for Life, and Legion can just benefit from all that, all the link juice, so to speak. And then it can also just take over the coaching, and really nothing changed. The branding of the coaching changed, but otherwise nothing changed. So that's that side of what I'm doing. And then there's the publishing side, because I've self-published my books. I've turned down name a publisher. I've turned them down because I will end up doing a traditional book deal 100%, but not yet. The deals that I've gotten offered were very generous deals, but the opportunity cost is just too high for me to want to jump on it and do what it would really take to I'd have to drop a lot to like do what Simon & Schuster wanted me to do, essentially, and I'm not ready to do that. So I continue to self-publish and push book sales in a number of different ways. I mean, it's not just me. Obviously, I have a team of people, but yeah.
I didn't realize your business was such a high turnover revenue. So I guess you probably consider yourself more of a businessman now than a kind of a fitness person. I don't want to say influencer, but one of those, a fitness icon, I suppose, because that's where I originally found you, was from your podcast. It's a great podcast, Muscle for Life, and I suppose that's kind of how I got you on today. I was listening to one specific show, which was a couple of months ago. I don't know the specific name of it, and this probably ties into the fact that you're a businessman now, that you're not now, but you're a pretty prolific businessman and you want to optimize all areas of your life, is that you had this episode where you specifically talked or used this process of how you read books. And I know my podcast, the Health Mastery Show, is, or it has been so far, more about health and fitness, and specifically kind of around natural bodybuilding, but that's just kind of one area of my life. I love to read. I've got this huge bookcase behind me with, I would say, a couple hundred books at this stage I've collected over the last few years. And when I listen to your podcast around your process and your workflow around how you read books, so not just read them to kind of say you read them. I often see people say, I'm going to read 50 books this year. I actually saw yesterday someone saying they're going to read 100 and something books this year. I was just thinking, that's such mental masturbation. If you're reading books for the enjoyment of them, let's say you're reading fiction, you want to enjoy that. But if you're trying to read non-fiction books at an alarming rate, where it's 2 books a week or even 1 book a week, how are you actually taking in that information, and then more importantly applying that information? So would you please talk me through your philosophy or your method for how you read books and how you maintain that information?
Yeah. To that point, in terms of reading a book a week or 2 books a week, I totally agree in that for me, it's not as much about the quantity as the quality, and it's also about the habit of spending time reading every day. So if I'm putting in my 60-ish minutes a day of reading, which is normal for me, I'm happy. And some books, it goes slower than others. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes I get a little bit annoyed because I get a little bit antsy wanting to move on, because I have so many books that I would like to read, and I'm going to die with a long to be read list, and that's just the way it is. But I'm not just reading to try to churn through pages and say that I read a bunch of books. And I've been as high as about 50-ish books in a year. And the reason why I was able to do that is I was probably putting a bit more time into reading, and then I was also listening to audiobooks while I had downtime. So if I was walking my dogs or preparing food or even driving, I would be listening to the audiobook of the book that I'm reading, and I was able to knock out probably an extra 30 or 40 pages a day just doing that. But I eventually stopped doing that because I found that if I was doing that, what I had to do is I had to buy the audiobook and the Kindle book, and then if they had WhisperSync enabled, then at least the Kindle would keep up with the audiobook. But if not, then fine, whatever. I'd be listening to the audiobook, And if there was something that I liked, if I wanted to make a highlight or a note, or I wanted to think about it for a second, pause the audiobook, think about it, flip back over to the Kindle, make the note, make the highlight, go back to the audiobook. If I was driving, I would have to pause it and just wait until I'm at a red light. And I don't drive that much, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But it was inefficient, but that's okay, because I was still getting through more content, but I just found that I retain information better if I read it, and I enjoy reading more than listening to audiobooks. And so now at that time, I'll listen to lectures, or I'll listen to interviews, things that I'm not going to be taking notes, or I might take notes in the sense of if I get an interesting thought or idea, I'll note it down. I use Google Keep for that. But I'm not going to I don't have a transcript that I'm working off of, that I'm making highlights. And you could argue that there's some material that's probably transcript worthy, but a lot of even podcasts, for example, it's not entirely necessary to take notes. Like if you listen to an episode and you have a couple good ideas and you note them down, okay, good. You usually can't expect much more than that out of an informal discussion of 30 minutes or whatever. And so now I spend that downtime doing that versus listening to books that I would prefer to read. And so now that means that I'm not getting through as many books. Maybe it's 20 to 30 a year, but the time that I'm spending, I feel, is more productive, and it also lets me get through some additional content that I would like to get through as well. And in the case of interviews, where I'll like to use that medium, so to speak, for stuff that I'm not sure, like stuff that just seems kind of interesting. I'm not sure if I'd really want to read a book on it, but I'd listen to an interview and see, does it spark any additional interest, or is it kind of just a dead end? So yeah, I just wanted to first comment on that point of it's not about the number of books for me, more so than like, am I reading the right books, and am I being I would say conscientious enough to ensure that I'm really actually learning something and giving myself a good chance to retain the information and apply the information. That's more important. And that also applies to when I'm reading. I don't read as quickly as most people. I'd say probably, yeah, most people, because I like to use a dictionary. I like to, if I'm not sure what a word means, I stop reading and I check it out in the dictionary. And if I'll have an idea, and I'll be like, so if I were being quizzed right now, what does this word mean? This is how I would define it. Am I right? And I'll go look in the dictionary. And if I'm wrong, then I take a minute to okay, so make some examples with this word, using it just to try to, again, and I also even specifically will try to make kind of vivid examples, ideally something that relates to my life, something that has happened to me, because that improves the likelihood that I'm going to remember the word. And sometimes I'll do that for other definitions if they're interesting. Check out the etymology just to kind of get an idea of where the word came from. So all that adds time. On average, it probably increases the amount of time that it takes me to get through a book by 50 to 100%. But the benefits, I think, are well worth the added time. And it is a little bit annoying when you're reading and you're wanting to get the information, and then you got to stop and get the dictionary. Well, I read digitally, so open up the dictionary, check it out, go through the process. But I've done that for a long, long time, and the benefits are I mean, I've actually written an article, and I may have recorded a podcast on it as well, just specifically regarding vocabulary, and the benefits of enhancing your vocabulary, I think, extend far beyond just verbal intelligence and fluency, but actually can impact your life in much deeper and more wide-reaching ways. And but what we know for a fact is I'm going to better understand what I'm reading, because like if I read a passage, and let's say there are a few words that I really didn't know, like my definitions for those words were completely wrong, And I'm going to come now to a different conclusion then, especially if those words are especially important to whatever the communication is. I'm going to come to a different conclusion about what I just read versus what the author intended for me to understand. I'm not going to be duplicating exactly what they were thinking when they wrote that. And assuming the author, sometimes, and this is a pet peeve of mine, I'll come across authors who don't have a very good command of language, and then it gets a little bit murky. I was like, that's not the right word, dude. Like, that doesn't mean what you think it means, but I think I know what you're trying to say. So I really have an appreciation of people who have very robust and very accurate vocabularies. And so if nothing else, I'm going to immediately understand better what I just read. And that also is going to increase the likelihood that I remember what I've read, because, and this is like simple, memory science 101, is you're going to remember stuff better that you understand, like on a conceptual level, that you can explain back to someone. That's like a little common trick that people like to use to enhance memory of something they've read, where they read it and then they you've just read a chapter. Now explain what you just read. Write it down if you need to, or whatever. And so by making sure that I have a good understanding of what I'm reading, and I'm not trying to just memorize words. I mean, that'd be the worst way to try to remember what you're reading, but to really grasp, like on a conceptual level, whatever is being communicated, that absolutely increases the likelihood that I'm going to remember what I've read, which is one important outcome that we want, obviously. Although we can get into this, I also extract all my takeaways, and I make it easy, because no matter how, unless we have like eidetic memory, no matter how hard we work on making sure we understand something and really read actively and not passively, as time goes on, we are going to forget a lot of what we read. We are going to forget a lot of what we liked. But what I've found is my little system, so to speak, has definitely served me well, in that oftentimes I will get bits and pieces of, like, whenever, if I'm talking about something, oftentimes I will get bits and pieces of things that I've read. Things will just come back. Like, I'm not even necessarily trying to remember. I'll just be like, oh, that reminds me of in this book, this person was talking about that. And the more that can happen, the better, especially if we're talking about something that's more applied, like take business, where you're trying to, let's say, come up with a strategy for a marketing strategy. And the more of that information that you can consciously recall, and then I think there's also something to be said for the subconscious changes that occur when you read, especially when it's not just facts and things, but there are things that change your perspectives and change your paradigms and change your worldviews on how things work and what your goals should be with certain activities. And that then is going to have a very big impact on it. Doesn't, even if you then didn't touch that material for 2 years, if you have maintained that core kind of change that came from when you first read it, it's going to positively influence your work in that sphere much later. So those are a lot of things that I think are worth sharing. But I'll give the mic back to you, and then you can let me know where you want to go from there.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I would ask is, what is your kind of thought process, or what is the process from start to finish? So, for example, I really do love to read, but at the moment I'm just so strapped for time with university. I just started a master's a couple of months ago, and pretty much all my time is read or spent reading papers and things like that. So a lot of the last week or two has been microbiology, so it's not that fun. But so I'm listening to audiobooks. So the one that I'm listening to at the moment is a new one from Ryan Holiday called Stillness is the Key.
Right.
But if you were to, let's say if you were to, with your time, so you didn't have any specific time constraints that meant that you could only listen to audiobooks, what way would you start, and what kind of apps would you use? And then what do you see the benefit would be from that? Because the way that you've explained it, I feel that a lot of people would listen and be like, well, that's a lot of work. Of course, I'm going to increase my vocabulary if I'm looking words up, but specifically with learning, what do you feel that would give benefit to? And you did touch on some of them already in terms of how they would lend, a helping hand to things like business and marketing. But where would you see the kind of trade-off there in terms of, if I'm going to spend all this time and I'm going to look, try to take notes on these things, how would they benefit your life in other ways?
Yeah. I think it's, if you're not continually educating yourself, your life is probably going to turn out a lot worse than you would hope. Period. Like, full stop. And of course, there are some types of education that are more relevant to that statement than others. And you have to read the right stuff, of course, but just in general, if you make halfway good selections and you stay you keep the habit and you stay diligent with it, it's just so. There's a book called Thinking in Systems that I actually just recently. I do this monthly book club thing where I recommend once a month a book that I liked, and I talk about the book and share like 5 key takeaways. Sometimes it's 3 if there's not 5. Sometimes it's a shorter book. Like, what are the 5 things that resonated with me most, and then what are my thoughts? Like, why did I like this, basically? And the next one that's going to be coming out soon-ish is called Thinking in Systems by Meadows is her last name. Her first name starts with a D. Anyway, and she talks about that basically everything that we think we know about the world is just a model. Every word, every language, every map, every statistic, every database, equation, computer program, whatever, they're all models. And so are the ways that we picture the world in our head. Those are our mental models. And none of those things will ever be the real world. And often, and this is kind of just us collectively, us humans, we've been good at creating models that have a pretty strong congruence with the world. And that's one of the reasons why we've been so successful, is we've been able to create these abstract versions of the world and then interact with those and think about how things should work, and then go do it and be like, hey, that worked out pretty well, actually. I made some good assumptions. But if our models fall short of representing the world fully and accurately, then we're going to make a lot of mistakes, and we're probably going to be very surprised. We're going to go into situations thinking that we have it figured out, and we're going to be applying oftentimes good reasoning given the information that we have. Let's say we have faulty information, a faulty model, but actually good reasoning with it. And then we go and we take actions in the real world, and things don't work out very well. And again, oftentimes we're very surprised and we're just confounded and baffled. Why did that not go well? And it's because that the model that we were working with in our head, the way that we thought reality is, and the way that we thought it works is actually wrong. And how then, and that happens to any of us. It doesn't matter your IQ. That gives you a little bit of an advantage, but even the highest IQ can only work as well, can only produce the outcomes, only can produce outcomes based on the information that it has. And so if you have bad information, which there are many people that have high IQs and a lot of very bad information, especially when we get into the more the stuff that's more qualitative and not quantitative, the stuff that you can't necessarily just measure and verify with a machine. And like take a person's values, for example, and take their personal philosophies about how they think things should and shouldn't work, and they think people should and shouldn't behave and shouldn't work. And so you can have a lot of bad ideas and but a high IQ, and that person is going to have a lot of bad outcomes. And that helps explain a lot of the bad outcomes that we see in the world. It helps explain a lot of the missteps and a lot of the mistakes that people make, and a lot of I think of the word manque, MANQUE, a lot of where people are unfulfilled. So you have where you know someone, we've all known that person who we thought had such potential, and they just squandered it. They just made a lot of dumb decisions and went nowhere, basically. Well, it's a good example of that. If you were in their shoes, operating within their worldview, looking at the world through the lenses of their mental models, you would probably be doing the exact same thing. Again, they're probably applying pretty good reasoning to really shitty models and really shitty information, and are getting really shitty outcomes and don't have enough self-awareness to really see what's going on. And so reading then, I mean, it doesn't have to be reading per se. Educating yourself. Reading is just a very effective way to do it. I prefer reading mostly, and we could talk about that. It might be more of a longer tangent, but I prefer reading. Reading's been the most effective for me because it seems like the most work goes into books, and especially good books where you have somebody who has like decades of experience, and then they write a book and they just condense all of their key teachings, their big lessons down into a book. And so you can just kind of download a couple decades of trial and error, whereas you're not going to get as concentrated, high-quality information out of YouTube videos or podcasts. So books have always just been a go-to for me. But the point is that we have to continually educate ourselves to continually refine and improve the accuracy of our mental models, of how we interact with life based on the information that we have. And right now, we all have a lot of incorrect information, and we're also missing a lot of information that could make a really big difference. And again, I'm not talking about just random facts so you can like win internet arguments. I'm talking about more essential assumptions and beliefs and attitudes and values and philosophies, the things that determine how we actually behave, which then of course determines the outcomes in any area of our lives. So I would say like the stakes are your quality of life. That's what's at stake, really. And one for one, the most successful people I know, and I don't just mean financially successful, because that's one thing. It's cool to make money, but it matters also, how are you making that money, for example? Like I have no I don't respect or admire people who make a lot of money dishonestly. Like, it means nothing to me. Just the fact that they're making money means nothing to me, because making money when you're as a liar is really not that hard. Like, if you can just get a good understanding of basic marketing principles and have like a little bit of a knack for it, you can make a lot of, and if you have some energy and you can work hard and you can just persist and grind, you can make a lot of money as a liar. It's really not that hard. But to do it honestly and actually provide real value, in that of course then is more admirable. But so the people that I know that are most successful in terms of making money in an honest, net positive way, where they really are giving back to society more than they're taking, and who have some semblance of a life outside of their work, and who don't, they've made a marriage work, and marriages always have ups and downs, and especially if a lot of work is involved, and that's normal. But they haven't, their marriage is still functioning and good, and they have good relationships with their kids, and their kids turned out well as well, and they are generally liked by other people, and they have a true network of like warm friends. These are all, I mean, I can think of a number of people, and they have been, one of their obsessions has always been just continually educating themselves. And that's always been a go-to thing for them. Any area in life where they were struggling, their default would be, I need to learn a bit more about this. I need to find where I'm wrong. Like, Ray Dalio, kind of radical honesty. I don't care to just dig in and assert my rightness. I want to know, what am I doing wrong and how do I fix it? That's all I care about, so I can ultimately actually be right and not just be dysfunctional, but insisting that I'm right. So for me, I mean, that's the answer as to like, well, why should I go through the trouble to do any of this? Because if you don't, your life is probably going to suck. Period.
Yeah.
If you have any ambitions, if you have no ambitions, then fuck it, dude. Just fucking smoke weed, play video games, jerk off to porn, and waste your life away on social media. You can do that, but eventually you are going to realize my life sucks. So even that's not a great choice. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, so he's taking kind of a critical analysis view on life by self-educating. So I think the people who actually want to be right will go and try and seek out opposite opinions or views to themselves, rather than actually trying to just reaffirm what they already know, or what they already believe, I should say.
Yeah, and value when people, even if it's people who are close to them, friends or coworkers, come to them and say, "Hey, I don't think you're right on this," where the instinctive response should not be a defensive, automatic assumption of like, it's time to argue, but it should be curiosity. It should be, really? What do you mean? How so?
Yeah, that can
explain. You know what I mean?
That can really eat up a lot of time. I know personally, because I used to kind of work with people or have close friends who are very kind of headstrong, or have very strong views on certain points, and that they won't be challenged on, and it will just break down to almost like a personal attack when you start to dig into the weeds. But if you're on the opposite side of the fence, you can spend a lot of time trying to prove yourself wrong in an attempt to actually be right, and you can, I won't say waste a lot of time, but specifically when it comes to things like training and nutrition, this real passion of mine. If I find that I have misthought something or don't understand something properly, I can spend hours and hours online trying to find the right answer, and may never find the right answer, and that can get into a massive rabbit hole, and you can waste a lot of time that's almost futile. But to come back to the topic of, it's pretty cool that the book that you just read, you're able to interlink that into why books are important. But how did you start the process of that? Did you buy the physical book? Did you take notes on that? Did you make shorthand notes of it? I know that's what you talked about in one of your podcasts that you did on your own podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read digitally. I do really like books, and so funny enough, so I'll buy hard copies of books I like, just to have them. But I read digitally because it's just too convenient. I can make notes. I can make comments, and it's all synced to the cloud, and then I can extract all of them out, which I do, which we can get to at the end of a book. And so, yeah, in the case of this, so I read it I read on a Kindle app on my phone, and I read first thing in the morning. So that's the first thing, is like, if you're going to get into a habit of reading, you have to be very specific as to when you're going to do it. And if you want to keep it simple, I think the BJ Fogg Tiny Habits approach makes sense. Of like, if you're not reading at all right now, start with reading 5 minutes a day, and you're actually not allowed to read more than 5 minutes a day. So you're going to pick your time. For me, it's first thing in the morning. So I wake up anywhere between probably 5:30 and 6, and then I have an infrared sauna that I go and sit in, just because it's nice, and there are a couple health benefits to it. And I read for the first probably 45 minutes or maybe 60 minutes of the day, and then I go to the gym and go to work and get started. I like to get it done first thing, because oftentimes I'm getting home from the office fairly late, and then I am helping put my son to bed, my wife's putting my daughter to bed, and then I'm making food for myself, eating, taking a shower, and then it's usually around 9 p.m. and I go to bed at 10. So if I'm going to spend any time with my wife, if I'm ever going to get laid, then I can't just sit and read for the rest of the night. And so, and then also sometimes I'm a little bit like, I actually find that just I need to wind down a little bit before I go to sleep, or chances are I'm not going to sleep well. Like I don't watch TV at night for that reason, because if it's stimulating at all, it actually fucks with my sleep, and it's pretty annoying. And so usually by the time everything is done, it's kind of just like, okay, let's wind down, spend some time with my wife, and and actually get a little bit sleepy so I can sleep well. And I do read sometimes at night, but I have found that to even be an issue depending on what it is. And so anyways, it's pick the time, and you can start real simple. And I think that is a good approach, and don't even let yourself do more than that. Like BJ Fogg talks about flossing, like the habit of flossing. Start with flossing one tooth, and you're actually not allowed to floss more than one tooth. And then once it becomes so easy that you don't even have to think about it, that's the point when it becomes really instantiated or really installed as a habit that you know is going to happen. Like there's no way you're not going to floss your one tooth tonight. Then that's when you know, cool, now it's time to up it to 2. And same thing with reading. So once you are waking, let's say you like the idea of waking up a bit early and getting it done first. I mean, if it's only 5 minutes, you don't have to do that much. But let's say that's what it's going to be. You're going to wake up, and for the first 5 minutes, you're going to read, and then you're going to get going with your day. Do that until it is automatic. You don't have to think about it. There's no question that you're going to do it or not. You have like an unbroken chain of, maybe a week or whatever, and then make it 10 minutes and do that until it's 10 minutes is just easy and automatic, and then 15, and then and so on until you're where you want to be. And if you are if you don't need the baby steps, if you could start with maybe your version of baby steps might be 15 minutes. Like that's easy. Committing to 60 minutes right out the gates, maybe not so much. 15 minutes, sure, no problem. Again, same idea. If you can go from 15 to 30 to 45 to 60, do that. But so that's the first thing, is making sure that you have it's just a matter of priorities, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I'm able to get a fair amount of reading done is I'm not up watching TV. I am in bed by 10 o'clock, which makes sure that I can get enough sleep to do everything that I need to do. And I'm not skimping on sleep to then like, oh, well, I'll go to bed at like 12 and I'll get up at 6 and then I'll sleep more on the weekends, which I can't do anyway because I have kids. But that for me, I never did that, just because it's not. It can work in the short term, but eventually sleep inadequacy, insufficiency, it catches up with you. So I think it's much smarter to just make sure you get enough sleep. And then as far as the format, again, so I'm 100% ebook these days, and I spoke about audiobooks and why I have moved away from them, and I just like it. I like it a lot more. And then there's a matter of choosing books to read. I often get asked for book recommendations because I do this book club thing, and I'll often talk about books that I like and stuff. And so people will reach out and ask for book recommendations for one thing or another. And I do have some like basic recommendations that I make. I often get asked about marketing, business. I mean, outside of fitness, marketing, business, and just kind of like life and philosophy and just being smarter and being better, right? Self-help, I guess, actually a good way to just to summarize that. And so what I do is I have a genre rotation that I use. And I have a morning reading session and an afternoon reading session. Although the last couple months I have chosen not to do the afternoon reading session because I've had a shitload of work and I've been traveling and constantly behind on the work things that I want to get done. And so honestly, I haven't really wanted to take the time away from it to get that extra 45, 60 minutes of reading in every day, but I will be putting it back in soon. Probably by the end of the month, I should be fully caught up and back on my normal schedule of producing all the things that I want to produce, which is mostly content related things. But I've also had a couple bigger projects, Legion related projects that are one-off things that just took a fucking lot of work that are almost done. And so what I do is I read, in my morning is my kind of like my personal reading, and that rotation is like a biography or a history book, and then a Be Smarter / Better book or two, and then fiction, literature, or poetry, and then just financial or miscellaneous. And so what I'll do is I'll read one or two books on each on a topic and the rotation, and then I'll move on to the next. So currently I'm reading a poetry. I'm reading a book called Good Poems by Keillor is the last name, Keillor, Keillor. And so that'll be, and before that, I have to look on my list. What did I read before that? I'm actually not sure. I keep a list of everything I read. I think, it was, don't remember. It was a Be Smarter / Better book. So for, which I read 2 of. And so this fiction, literature, and poetry rotation, this poetry book's like 500 pages. So I think I'm going to just do 1 and then move on to the next, which will be a financial or just miscellaneous book. Probably be financial. There are a couple other financial books I actually want to get through. And then in my afternoon rotation of reading, which again I haven't been doing in the last, at least for the last 4 to 6 weeks, but normally I do, are more work-related things. And so for that rotation, it's art, creativity, or writing, because I still do a lot of writing, and it's really kind of the pillar of my brand is the content I produce, and that all starts with researching and writing. And then a marketing or persuasion book, because you can never know enough about marketing. You can never be good enough at marketing or persuasion. And then a business or work. So it's like how to be better in business, or I should probably edit that one. Actually, it should be business, leadership, or work. But it's like those types of books. The next one I'm going to read, I already have it picked, is going to be Extreme Ownership, which I've heard a lot of good things about. I'm not impressed with Jocko Willink's content in general. Like his Discipline Equals Freedom book, I was like, how is this guy even a thing? How is this is like sophomoric. This is something I would expect from like a middle schooler. But apparently that book is really good. So I'm going to read it. And then a health, diet, or fitness book is the last in the rotation. And same thing. I'll read 1 or 2 books in each rotation and just move through it. And I also, before I read a book, if there's a book summary available on like Blinkist or InstaRead or Get Abstract, I always read that first, because if I don't like the book summary, I'm not going to like the book. If I'm not making any highlights, or if I don't have any, maybe not aha moments, but ooh, that's interesting moments in the summary, I'm not going to like the book. Period. So I've saved myself quite a bit of time by just doing that, where spend 15 minutes and read the book summary first. And then if I like the book summary, oftentimes I do find there's a lot more to be had by reading the book. You only can, especially if a book has a lot of good information in it, like these book summaries are short. They're only going to be able to give you so much. And I also prefer older books to newer ones, and I prefer fundamentals and first principles to complexities or later embroiderments on those things. And that's especially true when I'm new to something, or I'm just kind of looking for practical information. And the reasons for that is that if you have a deep understanding of the fundamentals involved in something, that is far superior to kind of understanding more complex ideas. And furthermore, if you don't really understand the basics, you're never really going to get the rest. And oftentimes, this definitely applies to health and fitness, especially when we look at it in the context of what's our goal. If we're talking about something that's practical, oftentimes, out of all the stuff that you could learn, it's the old 80-20 thing. 20% of what is out there is going to produce like 80% of the results. And unless you are trying to become truly outstanding in something, you're not going to need more than that 20%. If we put that in terms of fitness, like take a dude who starts out lifting. Most guys, at least most of the people I work with, Gen Fit crowd, most guys, they just want to gain maybe 30-ish pounds of muscle, maybe a little bit more, and have a body fat percentage around 10%, and that's it. Like that's the ultimate physique to them. And to do that, you don't need to know anything that would be considered sophisticated or advanced. All you actually need to know is everything that's in my book, Bigger, Leaner, Stronger. That's why I wrote it. It was really for that. Like if you're that person, if you're looking to gain 30 to 35 pounds of muscle and have abs and do that without having to spend a ton of time in the gym and do that eating foods you like, this is all you need to know. Literally, you could read this book and never learn another thing related to fitness, and you'll be happy for the rest of your life. Now, if they're someone like you and they were trying to squeeze every last ounce of muscle and strength gain out of their genetics, then no, of course you need to learn a bit more. But many people don't. They just make the mistake of, when they get into something new, they don't consciously go seek out those fundamentals, and you'll often find those fundamentals in older books, because if those books are still in currency, they've often stood the test of time for a reason. Like, especially if they've gone through multiple editions and many print runs, they often deliver the goods. Maybe they don't deliver everything in one book, but if a book has been able to withstand the scrutiny of decades or even centuries or even millennia in some cases, and still earn new readers each and every day and still get people talking about them, there's probably a good reason for that. There's even it's called the Lindy effect, that basically when applied to books, it's just a theory that the life expectancy of some like non-perishable thing, like technology or ideas, is proportional to its current age. And so then every further year that idea remains in circulation and remains alive, the chances of it surviving another year go up. And so as far as books go, it's really like the longer the books have been around, the longer their lifespans will likely be. And so that's why I expect to get more from a book that was written 30, 50, or 100 years ago that's still around and still popular. Now, of course, if it was published 100 years ago and it was one printing and nobody cared, and it just sits in you have a copy, you can find a copy in like your used bookstore or something. No, that's different. But a book that was written 100 years ago that people are still reading and recommending, yes, that is almost certainly going to be a better use of your time if you're new to something and you're needing to get to the fundamentals, than reading something that is more that is more contemporary. And so that's what I'll often do. I'll start by reading the classics on a subject, and those are very easy to find. You just do a little bit of Googling. You can find the classics on anything. You find plenty of lists, and you're looking for the people who really made the original discoveries, the original breakthroughs. And then I'll move on to, if I'm going to be reading deeper in that subject, I'll move on to more modern stuff. And oftentimes, though, I'll find more modern works like really don't add much to the seminal classics, where I will not recommend a lot of the more, especially when it comes to, again, the more practical things. Like marketing is a good example. I've read a lot of marketing books that I'm just like, whatever. I've read a lot of workbooks that I just straight up didn't like. I've read a lot of business books that I didn't like, because, again, I'm like, these if we're talking about marketing, like if you haven't read scientific advertising, tested advertising methods, breakthrough advertising, the Robert Collier letter book, Influence, How to Write a Good Advertisement, and the Ultimate Sales Letter, but you are, maybe I would add Persuasion to that, but you haven't read any of those, and you're reading books about internet marketing or email marketing, or just marketing books from our current whoever is big on social media these days, and touting themselves as a guru, you are doing it wrong. Because if you just read those books that I shared and understood them and took time to really get the information and then start applying them, that may not be enough to become like a world-class marketer. That comes with a lot of experience as well, but you will have everything you need to make good money as a marketer. You will never struggle to make money. And the same goes for many interests and activities. The key to achieving competence isn't the quantity of information you consume, but the quality and how well you get it and what you can do with it.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially in this kind of internet age where you just have so much information. It's hard to even distinguish or decipher what is good information or bad information. But like you said, those things that stand the test of time. And I think it's kind of ideas or subject or knowledge areas that are based on principles like business and marketing are things that you can rely on, older or original kind of ideas, but maybe more scientific things like perhaps nutrition. Because science is evolving and we get new research and it's based on hard facts and quantitative measures, that perhaps newer information there is often maybe a little bit better. Not meaning that
that's a good caveat. I could definitely, I would say in some cases science has just simply demonstrated you can find, if we're talking about training and nutrition, you can find quite a bit of good information in older books. But yeah, I think that's a reasonable asterisk. And I mean, hey, every rule has its exceptions, right? And so I totally agree with that. Although there aren't, like, what's an example though?
That's why I'm actually curious. I was curious when you said I read nutrition books, because people often ask me, well, I can have this like Instagram highlight of books I've read, and a lot of the marketing ones there that you've mentioned I have, but with nutrition books, I actually don't really recommend nutrition books that often, because in order to make the book interesting, it has to have cherry-picked evidence, because you don't want to read a book about here's balance and here's how to eat well. It's just kind of what your grandmother taught you, maybe a little bit extra protein if you want to gain muscle. But when you start to read books that have maybe cherry-picked scientific evidence for the average person who, number one, doesn't know how to read science, or number two, couldn't give a shit about reading science papers, that's kind of, well, I'm reading this science book and it's a kind of a novel, but when you really look into it, they're not actually scientific books at all. They're just kind of cherry-picked evidence books. So I don't really recommend them. So I'm curious to understand what kind of books you do read when you're reading nutrition books in your rotation.
No, I agree. And I mean, I try to find books that have the best chances of being good, and I often don't recommend even the ones that are scientifically sound are maybe not very useful. Like, I read a book called Diet Cults that had some good information, but I wouldn't really recommend it, because it was just kind of like, who cares? There's not it was just random, especially for anyone who's halfway educated. They're not going to find it very helpful. They may have learned some things, that some factoids, but beyond that, it's not going to be. They're gonna be like, cool. What am I? I guess I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, right? But there have been books here and there. Like, did you read Death by Food Pyramid?
I haven't, no.
By Denise Minger. I've been trying to get her on my podcast, but she doesn't reply. But
maybe she died by the food pyramid.
As far as I know, she's still around. So there was a book called Salt, Sugar, Fat that I liked. Again, this is because if we're talking about practicality, no, you don't need to read. Like, honestly, you could read. I'm sure there's some other books at this point that do just as good of a job as mine, but I'm not searching them out, because if I'm reading about health and diet and training,
you're getting more in depth.
I'm not going to read about energy balance. And so now, even coming back to what I was saying before, where I have the fundamentals now, and I have explained them many, many times in many different ways. And so if I'm reading, it's more, I'm just looking for something. It's going to be a thinner slice it's going to be a deeper dive into something specific. And so Salt, Sugar, Fat was interesting, because it was about just basically food engineering and food science, and how much work and money has been spent to make foods that are as highly palatable as possible. And so let's see, there was...
Actually, I have a recommendation if you haven't read it, by Stefan Guillenet. It's called The Hungry Brain. It's actually a very interesting book. It's about it's kind of about the how we overconsume foods that are highly palatable, and what's involved in high food reward foods. So like different kind of mechanisms that are going on in the brain, and why we select certain things and overeat certain foods. So it's more kind of a behavioral science book per se, with the element of nutrition in it, rather than calories. Here's how to eat different foods, or calorie balance equation, or more sciencey stuff. But if you haven't read that one, I really recommend that one. Kind of gives you a better understanding of why certain populations are overweight and why certain people can't stick to a calorie deficit.
Yeah. I have to check. It may be on my list already, but I've definitely come across it. And so, anyways, the point is, I agree. It actually is hard to find. It's hard to find health and fitness books that are worth finishing. Like, you can get. I'll give a book 50 pages. If by the 50th page, if I haven't made any highlights, or if I've made very few highlights, or if it's becoming clear this is not a book for me, then I have no problem stopping. At one point, I would always finish books, but that's just not smart. We only have so much time that we can spend.
Sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an opportunity cost. And instead of reading something that is really just not gonna provide much in the way of a return or a reward, we could take that time and put it into something that is. I'm sure you read the Lean Muscle Diet, which was good. I mean, it's the basics, but it's a good presentation of the basics.
When you highlight like phrases or paragraphs in books, do you then revisit those for like a kind of an active recall session in the future, or is that just once off thing? Is that how you get a lot of your ideas?
So what I do is I spend some time every week. I have a schedule that I follow. I usually, again, because I've been traveling and I've been behind, so I've been off my schedule, which annoys me, but usually I follow it pretty closely, where I've laid out exactly the things that I need to get done every week that are like my routine activities, and I time block everything. And I have time blocks also for like other stuff, basically, because there are always other things that need to get done, especially when I have a couple businesses and everything. Building a business it's kind of like everything is on fire at all times, and you have to determine, it's like triage. You have to determine which fires really need to be put out, which ones are like going to burn the whole building down, and which ones are just going to be allowed to burn. And if you can, if something's not on fire, you're like super happy about it. And so
you did really sell me on owning a business there.
I don't recommend it unless you can work a lot, unless you can comfortably work at least probably. Well, okay. If you want it to be a successful business, if it's like a lifestyle thing and it's just a little side income, that's totally different. But if you want to build a real business and you're going to hire people and you're going to try to turn it into a real 7 or 8 or 9 figure kind of concern, then you have to be very comfortable working at least 60 hours a week, and working, not like at the computer with Instagram open and the TV going on. No, like really real actual work every day, one thing to the next, very little breaks, and doing that for long periods of time. You have to also, I think, the more risk averse you are, the less I would recommend getting into business. You have to be a person who can take calculated risks and put a lot of money and time on the line, and basically, like, you only can do so much due diligence and so much preparation. There's a point where you just have to throw the dice and see how it comes out. I would say you have to be financially literate. If you really don't like dealing with numbers and you're bad with money, that's another reason to not get into business. And you have to be willing to get good at marketing. You have to find a way to like selling, because if you don't, your business will always struggle. And anyways, that's, I guess, a different conversation. But as far as highlights go, so I'll read a book, and then I will have in my little schedule a time block for just pulling out highlights. I usually do on the weekends, like Saturday, Sunday mornings. I'll take some time. And Kindle's made this even easier now. I don't have to use their software, because it's like, what's the URL? It's like notepad.kindle or whatever. It's on Amazon. You can just click on a book and see all of your highlights. And so I just copy and paste them into, you can't export them all because you're limited. Some books you can, but oftentimes the limit is pretty small in terms of how much material they'll allow you to just straight export. So it's usually a copy and paste, but that's fine. It doesn't really add any time, because what I'll do now is I'm going back through all of my highlights. I'm copying and pasting them into a Google Doc specifically for that book, and I'm rereading them and I'm weighing them, and I'm like, and then in the end, what I have is I have my key takeaways, which are the things that I liked the most from the book, and I even then bold like the super key ones. These are the biggest takeaways for me. And then I have all of my highlights with my notes as comments on the highlights. And so then what that allows me to do is very easily, one, it improves retention to some degree, of course, but I can then, if I really cared, I could even come back to them on a regular schedule. But I don't think that wouldn't be a smart use of time, because unless there are some books that it's worth reviewing them consistently, and other ones it's just not. Like if I wanted, let's say I needed to do a podcast on a book I read 3 years ago, I can just go pull up my Google Doc and just go over it and be like, oh yeah, cool, it's all coming back, got it. Would it be worth me like loading my key takeaways into SRS flashcard system and spending time on that every day just so I can remember random things? Not really. Maybe if my life revolved around trying to make people think I'm interesting or something. So that's what I'll do then is, though, there are some books like marketing books and business books that I like that I will often, well, let's not say often, I would say maybe every couple months, few months or so, just go back through and see, because things change. And how I viewed, the reason why a certain takeaway resonated with me back when I read the book or when I last reviewed it, I might now have a new idea. And so it's just a very efficient way to be able to review a book, because I don't think there are many books that are worth, if you have that, there aren't many books that are worth just rereading from scratch. That's not always the case, but it's especially the case with a lot of how-to stuff. Like if you did a good job reading it the first time and you pulled out really the key takeaways, which often, especially how-to nonfiction books, really oftentimes like 2/3 of those books are just filler. You could just literally cut out all the words and just get to the point. Because oftentimes a book, like a chapter, will have one idea, really. That's the idea. And then it needs, though, a bunch of preamble. So what's the preamble? Oh, it's personal stories, it's other anecdotes, it's maybe some scientific research, blah, 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 filler, essentially, to convince you that this is cool or this is interesting, and then it's the idea.
Yeah, I think I do a similar thing with, I don't actually take notes, but because I read the physical books often, but you're selling me on the idea of getting a Kindle, because I do like taking notes, and I've started using some more notes apps with my iPad and Mac just simply for studying for university. But I will actually use Blinkist after I read the book. So you said you used it before. I think it was last week, I was thinking about this book called Drive. It's about why people are motivated.
I know that. Yeah.
And I was like, that was a really good book, but I can't remember why it was really good. Like what are the key 5 principles? But just go back to Blinkist, and then that'll cover off those things. But I'm probably going to move towards the idea of doing a Kindle. I don't know if I'll be able to manage it on a phone. That seems like pretty difficult for me to read Kindle.
I have no notifications on my phone. I don't really have no apps. I have no game. I have Instagram because I use it for my work, but otherwise I don't spend any time on Instagram. So I find that it could be distracting, but because I get a notification if somebody calls and if somebody texts. Otherwise, my phone just sits there silent. But yeah, I understand that. You could, of course, get another device.
Yeah, I think that comes back to the idea of you being a successful businessman. And we didn't really touch on the topics today, but you're not just the fat CEO. You actually have a pretty great physique. If anybody knows who you are already, or if they want to check you out afterwards, you got not just a decent physique, but a very admirable physique. No homo. That a lot of people would aspire to, I guess. So I suppose that's probably a topic for a future episode, because we've already gone past the time mark. But you don't just have a successful business and a family life and kids and stuff, but you have a really good physique. Almost, I would say, stage worthy physique. If anybody's trying to visualize, because this is not on video, but a good, decent, natural looking physique. But if we're to wrap this up, I suppose I would ask you, what 5 books would you recommend for somebody who, let's say, doesn't read, but they want to get into reading and they want to improve their life in just every single facet or area? What 5 books would you recommend that they would read, that one, they can actually properly read? So maybe they're not able to read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius because they're not that literate, I won't say literate, but they're not that. They don't have that much
I would
vocabulary.
say I don't know. I would say Meditations is pretty accessible.
Think so?
Because that was going to be one of my books. But anyways, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, if I do like Stoicism myself, but if I recommend people getting into Stoicism, it's sometimes it's difficult to consume in terms of the way that they speak.
It's kind of poetic. I mean, it's not.
Yeah, so
it's not
I usually
conversational.
recommend people that they maybe read some Ryan Holiday first, or some the Tao of Seneca from Tim Ferriss, and if they like the ideas, then they move on to some things like that.
Yeah.
Actual.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Like,
stuff.
they start with the obstacles the way. I mean, ironically, I think Ryan writes better articles than books, but he does a good job. He doesn't impress me, honestly, in the way that, like, someone is, if we're talking about writing skill, Ron Chernow, the biographer, straight impresses me. And if we're talking about impressive writing and how the just thinking, like how their mind works, Will Durant, the historian, actually impresses me. But Ryan does a good job. I don't know him, but I respect that he's a hard worker and he cares and he's into it. So that's cool. And yeah, I'd say if you want to dip your big toe in Stoicism, read The Obstacle is the Way. And if you like that, I also remember I had some takeaways from Ego is the Enemy. And I don't know if I'll read his new one. Maybe. There are many other things that I probably would read instead. But
yeah, I'm finding that it's good, but it feels like lots of different just ideas just smashed together. So just you just kind of going all over the place, but like good excerpts.
So like almost like a bunch of articles or essays, just kind of.
Yeah, kind of like that, and that's exactly what Mark Manson does actually. Because I'm a member of his website, and if you read his book, he just hey, I've read this book already, but it's just released because he just smashed lots of
It's
articles
funny,
there.
right? I mean, dude, he wrote all that stuff on his website, and then that Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck sold like a motherfucker. That book is definitely over a million copies sold. It's probably several million copies sold. So it just goes to show that if you have, I mean, I think Tim Ferriss essentially did the same thing with the 4 Hour Body, which of course is a pile of shit. But I think a lot of it was just on his blog.
I haven't.
And I'll do
read
the
it,
same
but,
to. Yeah, it's not worth reading. It's actual garbage. But I'll do the same thing with books of mine, where I'm totally fine publishing a fair amount of them on Legion's blog, because a lot of people are not going to see those articles, or they're not going to, of course, get it in the context of like, take periodization. I published an article on periodization just recently, and a lot of that material is going to be in. It's actually, I was working on the book I'm working on, and I figured like, hey, this is. I don't have a good long form article on periodization. Let's publish this on the blog. And I've never had anyone complain like, hey, why was that periodization information on the blog too? So you can absolutely do that for anybody who's an aspiring writer. I think it's actually a good way to. If you have anything of a following already and you want to write a book, turn a lot of it into blog posts as well. You can always withhold. I'll at least hold back 20 or 30% of the content. But even if you published literally 100% of it and then published it as a book, and took the time to add connective tissue and really bring it together as a cohesive, it might also be in even a different order than you initially published in the blog. It's like, I don't think that is, I don't think that it is.
it doesn't detract from the book, yeah. Even if you,
yeah, I don't think it's even untaste or distasteful. You know what I mean? I think it's totally fine. But anyways, to your question, all right. So some book recommendations. I would recommend The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. I would recommend The One Thing by
Gary
Keller.
Keller.
Yeah, Keller. I would recommend The Magic of Thinking Big by David Schwartz. A little bit cheesy, but I still think it's good information. I would recommend, again, if we're just talking about like just being better in general, I'd recommend Principles by Ray Dalio. Very dry and he doesn't try to entertain you at all, but he's a very smart dude and he's done a lot and he's experienced a lot, and a lot of his ideas I really, really agreed with, and I think there's a lot in there. If you really took it to heart, it could really make a big difference in your life. I really liked Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I think is how you pronounce it. And I don't know if I believe that flow is kind of the end all be all, but I think there's a lot to be said for trying to figure out how you can get and stay into a flow state more often in your life, and things will just be better that way. And Meditations by Aurelius, I would recommend that. Again, it is a bit it's not conversational, and some of the stuff reads a bit clunky, and you do have to kind of go back and read it again and think about it for a second. But there are a lot of gems in that book, especially when you consider who he was, of course, and that's where a lot of the popularity comes from, because you have to imagine yourself as the emperor of the Roman Empire, and would you think about that, and think about this guy's character, considering the position he was in. He didn't have to be the philosopher king. He could have just been the tyrant, and it would have been one and the same. As far as his life, it's unlikely that he would have been deposed. So so that's one. I'll add the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Very wordy, and Covey is not a good writer, to the point of it's actually annoying to read him. But a lot of great ideas in that book. Should have been half the size, and should have been more conversational and more enjoyable to read, and less like a textbook, but still a great book. And one other is Getting Things Done by David Allen, just because we're getting kind of into work now and business or whatever, but work is a major part of our lives, and the more organized and effective we can be, and the more productive we can be with our time, the better. And what you'll learn in that book applies to your work and your job, but also applies to really any activity that you want to approach seriously. The more organized you can be with it, and the more efficient you can be, and the more output you can get for every input of your energy, the better. And from there, I would say branch out. I mean, I really like reading history books. I like reading biographies and behavioral psychology books. I enjoy, but they're usually marketing related books. I have read some books that were just kind of for fun, like Thinking Fast and Slow, and I liked them, but I only have so much time to read, and again, my focus is generally on application. Like I'm trying to improve my life in different ways, and so I'm often reading books that I think will contribute, even if it's indirectly, like that Thinking in Systems book. I really liked that because that is a kind of like it's funny if you think about different elements of a system. In our lives, we're interacting with systems every day. I mean, our bodies are systems, our minds are systems, animals are systems, the businesses are systems, economies are systems. We're surrounded by systems. And the better we can understand how these systems work, and they do have common denominators in terms of types of elements and types of relationships between those elements that can take infinite number of forms, and so you can pinpoint, for example, there are in the book she shares different elements, for example. So you have goals, you have, I think actually at the top it's like paradigms, and then as you move down the list you get to goals, and you have elements of what's called self-organization, you have information flows, you have rules. This isn't in order necessarily, it's just things, that elements in systems, like ranging from our digestive system to our financial system, or the Federal Reserve System, for example. Those two things have a lot more in common than you might think when you're able to kind of overlay this idea of systems thinking on them. And those different elements they have the same types of functions. It's just the actual material is different, of course. So the delays that are involved in your digestive system are different than the delays involved in a central banking system, but they're still delays nonetheless. And so by learning about systems and how they work, it just can impact so many different aspects of your life, for the reasons that I was talking about earlier, in terms of mental models, for example. And systems thinking will help you create better mental models. You also can study mental models. The next Be Smarter, Better book I'm going to read is called Super Thinking, which is it's a kind of an encyclopedia of different mental models, which are useful ways to look at situations. And by understanding that these types of situations tend to behave in certain ways, you can then extrapolate and predict what is probably going to happen or most likely to happen given the current circumstances that you're faced with. Game theory is another higher order topic that you can learn about, because, for example, with game theory, you can extrapolate a lot. It applies to business. It applies to really any arena where there's competition. It applies to negotiation. A lot of negotiation tactics are just based on simple understandings and applications of game theory principles. And so you could read the lower level stuff and just learn the tactic, but what if you could learn the principles behind the tactics, which allow you to then maybe even come up with your own versions of tactics? Maybe you're not going to make huge breakthroughs, and that's fine, but I think I like to look for those high leverage points of information. And so that's why one of the reasons why I like biographies and I like history books, because when you can really learn about someone who did something very successfully that you want to do, inevitably you pick up on things that you just wouldn't pick up on otherwise, and you're not going to learn about in a kind of distilled down self-help book that is also the way that self-help books have to be sold. They're very formulaic. I mean, if you read one in terms of a formula or a system they use, you've read them all. It's almost to the point where it's like tiresome now. You can predict exactly how these books are going to open, what to expect in the first 50 pages, what the middle territory is going to be like, and then the ending, how they're going to try to wrap up. But if you read about the life of someone who did something extraordinary, you will come to your own insights also in terms of what they were doing that was working and what was not working, and what is most relevant to you in your life. And so that's why I have that biography history rotation in my or genre in my rotation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And they can be a slog. I mean, that might mean that you go. Some of these are big books. A small one might be 200 or 300 pages, but they could be 1,000-page books. But I've found them not just enjoyable, but also very beneficial.
Yeah, the key, I guess, is to really understand why you're reading the book in the first place. Is just to complete it and say you've completed it, or to actually extract the value from it. Then it doesn't really matter how long the book is in itself. But I really appreciate you sharing that, and I think I've got at least 4 or 5 of those books within an arm's reach of me. But there's 1 or 2 that I need to read up on, and some of them I actually want to revisit. I think a good book is like an old friend; you can revisit it over and over again. But Mike, if people want to find out more information about you, or want to consume some of your content, or get some of your books, or listen to your podcast, where's the best place that they can reach you?
LegionAthletics.com is kind of my online hub. And then as far as social media, I'm not too active, but I'm most active on Instagram, and I can be reached there. And over at Legion, and books, you can wherever you get books online. Also, a number of my books are in Barnes and Noble stores all over the country. And but Legion Athletics is where you'll find. I probably have 1,000 articles now published on the blog, and I don't know, hundreds of podcast episodes, and we're going to be doing more in that regard as well. Probably start another podcast, and I believe wholeheartedly in the value of good content marketing, so it's something that I'm always putting time into.
Thanks so much again, Mike, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I hope you enjoyed that podcast, Mike. It was definitely something different than what we talk about on this podcast. But I personally really enjoy talking to people who are business savvy and who try to grow themselves, not just physically in the gym, but also in terms of their career or their life outside the gym as well. So I really enjoy talking to Mike. Business has always been something that's been of interest to me. I tried to set up multiple businesses all the way through my late teenage years and in my early 20s, and failed each time. And I did a degree, of course, in business, and that was my original what I was studying in bachelor level. And now I'm doing nutrition, but That's what I did first. And I really just admire people who are successful in all areas of life. So if you do like this podcast, or if you found this kind of style where I talk to people who are perhaps in the fitness industry but have achieved great success in other areas, then please do let me know, because I want to put out content that people like to listen to. But I will get back to the regular routine of talking more specifically around fitness and health topics, more specifically around bodybuilding. But if you do have any questions for myself or Mike, please do reach us out at our emails or through our handles. And again, as always, if you did enjoy it, please leave a rating and review. But until next time.